You're listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast with Matt Tomasi and can be found at borntokickarse.com/episode 31.
Welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast, where you're introduced to the most fascinating people on the planet. Learn the ingredients of greatness that you can apply to your life. And now your host, Matthew Tomasi.
Today's podcast is brought to you by audible.com. Get a free audiobook of your choice and a 30-day free trial by visiting borntokickarse.com/audible. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle or MP3 player. To download your free audiobook today, go to borntokickarse.com/audible. Again, that's borntokickarse.com/audible for your free audiobook. Tim Jarvis is an environmental scientist, author, adventurer, public speaker, Australian Adventurer of the Year in 2012, and a member of the Order of Australia. Tim has undertaken many unsupported expeditions to some of the world's most remote regions, including the North and South Poles, across Australia's largest desert, the Great Victoria Desert, and kayaked across Australia's largest salt lake, Lake Eyre. In this interview, Tim talks about leading the first authentic retracing of polar explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton's greatest survival journey of all time. Tim and his crew sailed 1,500 kilometres from Elephant Island across the Southern Ocean to South Georgia in a replica boat with no keel, then climbed over South Georgia's frozen mountainous interior using the same rudimentary equipment, period clothing and technology that Shackleton used 100 years ago. Enjoy the interview. Tim Jarvis, welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast.
Great to be here.
Now you are, you've got a lot of accolades to your name and you've done a lot of adventures. You're an environmental scientist, you're an author, you've published a number of books, you're an adventurer, public speaker. You've done a number of unsupported expeditions to some of the world's most remote regions, the North and South Poles. You've crossed Australia's largest desert, the Great Victoria Desert. You're also a member of the Order of Australia. And yeah, you've got a massive list of expeditions and accolades to your name. But what I really wanted to talk about with you today is this Shackleton epic. But before we sort of get into the Shackleton epic, how did you actually get into expeditions and adventures? Was this sort of like something that sort of ticked you off or awoken that sort of thing within you from a young age, the whole adventure?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Look, I would say I think everyone's got an adventurous side to them. It's just a question of whether you really breathe life into it and allow it to run. I think for me, I grew up in Malaysia as a small kid, and my brother is a lot younger than me, so I was sort of a kid on my own, essentially amusing myself. My parents used to say, go out there and find things to do, and there was a lot of jungle around. There were monkeys, there were wild dogs, there were old tin mining dredges, there were all sorts of good things to explore, and I just got into it, and I got used to spending a bit of time in the outdoors on my own, and it grew and grew and grew from that initial seed. That's the best way I can describe it. But I was always an inquisitive kid anyway. And, you fast forward 25, 30 years and you're doing some of the biggest expeditions you can imagine because you've just continued on that trajectory.
Now, one of the big ones was the Shackleton epic. Can you, I personally hadn't really known too much about Ernest Shackleton until I started doing research on yourself for this particular interview. but can you give listeners like a bit of a brief summary of Ernest Shackleton and this amazing survival story that he went through and rescue mission as well that he undertook?
Sure, yeah. I mean, he was a heroic era polar explorer, so he was around in that time around the First World War, just before the First World War, so the early part of the 20th century, and he was a contemporary of Mawson, Douglas Mawson, and Scott at the Antarctic, who of course died with all of his men down at the South Pole, and the Norwegian Amundsen, who was a competitor of Scott's. He was an incredible guy. He was Anglo-Irish. He decided to go down to the Antarctic on what was his third expedition in 1914, right on the eve of the First World War. And in fact, he was just ready to go with his ship. It'd taken several years to get all the men together for the expedition. He got all the equipment together, and war broke out. And apparently he received a note from Churchill saying, "Proceed." In other words, go ahead with the expedition. Don't worry about the war. We'll sort that out from this end. And so off he went down to the Antarctic, and the goal was to take the ship down there, make a camp on the coast of Antarctica, on the kind of South Atlantic side of Antarctica, if you like, and then try and be the first people to cross Antarctica from one side to the other, which had, at that stage, never been done. And in so doing, he thought he could eclipse what Scott and Amundsen had done, which is to reach the South Pole, which is just the midway point of the Antarctic. So he was going to go from one side via the South Pole to all the way across to the other side. Of course, everything went wrong with the expedition. The ship, Endurance, was crushed in the pack ice before he set foot on the land of Antarctica. He got about within 60 or 70 k's of the coast, and then the ship got stuck in pack ice and it was crushed. And so he and his men spent 10 months living in the stricken ship before she went down, stuck in the pack ice, and then they lived on the pack ice for another 5 months. And then when the ice broke up, they got in their 3 rowboats, the expedition lifeboats, 27 men plus Shackleton, and they paddled for their lives to a place called Elephant Island just off the Antarctic Peninsula, and he left most of the men there. Then he headed off across the Southern Ocean from Antarctica to the subantarctic to try and reach a whaling station, raise the alarm, and save all the guys that he'd left behind. And he managed it against all the odds. He arrived at the island he was trying to get to, where there was the whaling station, but he arrived on the wrong side of the island. The whaling station was on the sheltered northern side. He arrived on the southern side, so he has to cross the mountains with no equipment, no tent, no maps. Nails pushed through the soles of his shoes for grip. And he made the first ever crossing of the mountains of South Georgia to reach the whaling station, raise the alarm and save everyone. And Edmund Hillary, who first climbed Everest, said it was the greatest survival journey of all time. So Shackleton is one of these legendary guys, as I say, a contemporary of Mawson and Scott and Amundsen, and regarded by many as the greatest of the heroic era polar explorers.
Now, I just want to sort of highlight as well, you've also done a recreation of Sir Douglas Mawson's 1913 trek across Antarctica, but that's another podcast episode in itself. Now, with Shackleton, you recreated this epic expedition that he underwent himself. How did this come about? Like, I'm guessing, why did you want to recreate this particular journey that Shackleton undertook?
Well, it's a big one. I think if you're into polar expeditioning like I am, I've been south 4 times at that stage to Antarctica and 4 times up to the high Arctic at the time that I did this trip. You know, it was it's the biggest expedition you can do. So that was an attraction. No one had managed to do it since Shackleton had done this incredible journey of survival across the Southern Ocean and climbing through the mountains since he did it out of necessity back in 1916. So that was a kind of a big attraction to push oneself and try something, you know, at the extreme end of what's possible. The short answer is I was asked by his granddaughter if I'd assemble a team, and I'd already been thinking along the lines of doing it anyway. And she is a woman who she's pretty formidable. She's now become a very good friend. But she asked me, on the basis of me doing the Mawson expedition successfully, where I did it using old equipment, old food, same calories, same sleds, that kind of thing, no GPS, no sat phones, whether I'd be prepared to attempt her grandfather's journey in the same way. So I said yes.
That would have been tough. Using all the equipment that Shackleton used 100 years ago.
Yeah, look, it was. I mean, I think, so he rebuilt his lifeboat, just in case listeners don't know. I mean, the lifeboats on these old Royal Navy ships, just like the Australian Navy ships from that era, are basically surf boats. That's all they are. They're just a rowboat, 23 foot, about 6.5 meters long. They sit pretty low in the water. They had a little toy mast and toy sail on them and oars to row with, but essentially they're not ocean-going boats. They're very, very small. So we rebuilt that. We wore the same clothing, and the clothing is just cotton outers on top of woolens and leather boots. None of it's waterproof, by the way, which is bad for a very cold Antarctic ocean journey. We use no GPS. We just use sextants and chronometers and compasses. We had to, and learn how to use sextants and chronometers properly. And we ate the same food as they did, which was lard and beef jerky and sugary tea and a bit of whiskey. So it was a tough old trip, I have to say.
So how long did the planning take from seed through to when you launched off Elephant Island? How long did that take?
About 5 years. 5 years. It was I was asked if I would do it. I said yes immediately, by the way. And then there are plenty of times in the middle of the night where, you wake up and you start thinking about what it would be like to be, sitting in a wooden boat with no keel. In other words, it capsizes very, very easily. Somewhere out in the darkness of the Southern Ocean with 2 degrees Celsius water, and, you go upside down in a storm. And I tell you what, it keeps you awake when you start thinking of that. But I said yes immediately, and then there are times you have doubts, but you push through with it. And 5 years later, we did it. But like I say, it was a pretty major undertaking.
So you were the expedition leader, and how many crew did you have in? What was the boat called?
It was called the Alexandra Shackleton, after the granddaughter had asked me to do it, and she was the patron of the whole expedition. The original boat was called the James Caird, named after one of Shackleton's major sponsors.
And this was like a replica of the James Caird?
Yeah, so look, the original, we're lucky, the original still exists, and it's in his school in London, so we managed to get permission to go in there and measure it, and we did all the lofting, all the nautical architecture based on and the original boat, so we could copy it very, very precisely. But it is what it is. It's just it's got it's a bit of oak and some large planks, and you're just sleeping on the ribs of the boat with reindeer skin sleeping bags in a very wet, very cold, seasickness-inducing, unsafe boat. It's very, very interesting experience.
Now, with the crew, each like you were the expedition leader, the other crew members, what sort of skills did they have? I know one was the like the skipper, I guess, of the boat.
Yeah, so Shackleton had 5 other people on the boat with him, and let me tell you right from the outset that a large number of people is a disadvantage because the living space below deck is about the size of a queen-size double bed. It's very, very small. You're just 6 of you, 5 of you there. One is on the helm of the boat at any given time, and then just rotate. So there were 6 of us total, including me. We had 3 sailors, 3 climbers. The idea was that if we could get to South Georgia across the Southern Ocean from Antarctica, we would the sailors would help us get there. The climbers had done a lot of sailing training, by the way, over the previous couple of years. And then if we could get to the mountains of South Georgia, make a landfall on South Georgia. Then the 3 climbers, of which I'm one, would help the sailors get over the mountains. And the sailors also did a lot of climbing training. So, and look, they were a very high caliber crew. We had Nick Bubb was the skipper. He's a round-the-world sailor, Volvo round-the-world single-handed team sailor. He's a Brit. Paul Larson from Melbourne, he's got 7 world records in sailing. He's the fastest sailor in the world. He's fastest across the Atlantic. He's 64.5 knots in a sailboat, that's about 135, 140 k's an hour. It's amazing what he's done. We had a Royal Navy guy who did all the electronics for making a film, not for navigating. So we had cameras and all sorts of stuff fixed on the boat. And then we had a guy called Barry Gray, who's the Regimental Sergeant Major for the Royal Marines Regiment in the UK. He's an elite outdoor mountaineer, and he's head of outdoor survival for the UK Armed Forces. And then a guy called Ed Wardle, who's a Scotsman who is the UK's freediving champion and also summited Everest 3 times. They're a very, very good crew of people.
Now, just for listeners, people might not really know where Elephant Island is. I guess if listeners are sort of listening to this on the go, I highly recommend to just whack into Google Elephant Island. That is there's a peninsula in Antarctica, and it's an island just off that, which is south of the tip of Argentina. Now, this is pretty much in the middle of nowhere, and you were going to recreate Shackleton's journey from Elephant Island to South Georgia, and that's, if people sort of know where the Falkland Islands are, which the Falkland Islands are pretty much to the east of the very bottom part of Argentina, South Georgia is further east from the Falkland Islands. Now, this looks like an unbelievable journey. It's sort of hard to fathom what's in between Elephant Island and South Georgia. Can you tell us about the Southern Ocean? I've heard that Southern Ocean is the most violent and turbulent ocean in the world. Is that true?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's to answer your question, between Elephant Island, just on the Antarctic, just off the Antarctic Peninsula, like you say, and South Georgia, which is about 1,000 clicks east of the Falklands, there is nothing. There's nothing in between those two. And if you miss South Georgia, there's nothing between you and South Africa, which is about another 4,500 k's further on. So it is really the middle of nowhere down there. Southern Ocean, the temperature is about 2 degrees Celsius. And the currents come from, basically, if the listeners can imagine it, the currents drain from the Pacific on the western side, on the left-hand side. They move to the east, to the right-hand side, into the Atlantic. And they do so at about 3 times the volume of the Gulf Stream, which is that massive oceanic current further north. And there's no way known you can sail into that, particularly in a surf boat. And so you just have to literally go with the flow, and the currents are pushing you out into the southern Atlantic from Antarctica. And that's why Shackleton aimed for South Georgia. It was the only place he could go for. And so we did the same thing.
Yeah, it's quite incredible. You've actually made a documentary on this, which I'll put links to in the show notes. But I just want to talk about, so with the clothing that you're wearing pretty much the same sort of clothing that Shackleton wore 100 years ago, which you've mentioned earlier. When you guys set off from Elephant Island, do you ever get dry, when you're sort of underneath sort of the cabin part of the boat, or are you pretty much wet from launch through to, from the moment you set off?
As I recall, we were wet the whole way. I mean, the thing is that Shackleton's original journey to cross Antarctica was a very dry, would have been a very dry journey. I mean, Antarctica is the driest, windiest continent in the world. Some places have had no, snowfall or rainfall of any description for several 100,000 years. It's very, very dry. So, crossing that, you wear clothing which is breathable and windproof. You're not worried about the wet. And so his clothing was not designed for an open boat journey. There were cotton smocks that keep the wind off, about twice the thickness of your work shirt. They're not thick or insulated. And then you wear woolen layers under that for the insulation, and you wear leather boots. And that's what he had, and that's what we had. And it's not waterproof at all. And, the temperatures were not the coldest I've ever experienced, in that I've experienced, minus 48 before, and very, very strong winds, but they were very cold, obviously. But the big problem is that you're wet all the time, and you're not moving, and so you can't generate heat. And, it is very challenging to try and keep your morale up, and also to avoid getting hypothermic.
So how did you manage the onset of hypothermia?
Spooned with the other guys. Spooning body heat, shared body heat. Yeah, it should have been in our risk assessment. We kind of let that slip through. But just about the only consolation with having a very small space to live in is that you're sharing body heat whether you like it or not, because you're pretty much sitting on top of one another. There's no space to stretch out. You're sitting, everybody's legs are sort of over the top of one another's legs. You're just a pile of bodies below deck in the darkness in the boat. And the advantage is that over 4 or 5 hours until it's your shift back on the deck again, your body heat can do a little bit of drying. But I would never say we were dry. You're just differing degrees of wetness.
Now, you mentioned as well earlier that this boat, the Alexandra Shackleton, the boat that you set off on, didn't have a keel. That sounds frightening. Like you're heading out into the Southern Ocean with pretty much almost like a flat bottom boat. Is that right?
Yeah,
not really
that's
flat
right.
bottom, but with no real keel.
Yeah.
How did you How did you prevent the boat from tipping over?
With a certain amount of difficulty, I can tell you. As I say, if listeners can just imagine if they've ever seen surf boat rowing, we were basically in a surf boat with what the carpenter on Shackleton's original trip did was to build up the sides of the boat by about another 40 centimetres and put a little deck on it. But the deck didn't keep the water out. It just stopped the worst of the waves crashing in. So it leaked and the water came through just like it did with us. But at least it stopped you getting completely swamped with every wave that came in. And there were many that did, of course. To answer your question, you just keep all the weight as low as you possibly can. And Shackleton put a ton of rocks off the beach at Elephant Island in the bottom of his boat before he set off. And the idea was that weight of rocks would keep the boat very low and hopefully stop it from tipping over. We used exactly the same weight in the bottom of our boat. We just used a combination of rocks and camera batteries to give the same weight. It did an okay job, but when you're going down the face of big waves and the boat starts to turn sideways or you're in a big storm, you're living in constant fear of the thing tipping up. And we came very close quite a few times.
Was there ever a chance of the rocks that were sort of lodged at the bottom, sort of, if you were in a real bad storm, was there ever a chance of those rocks hitting you guys? Well,
there would have been. What we did was we put them in these sacks. That's what he did. He picked them off the beach and put them in these the old sacks they had that had previously had food provisions and stuff like that in them, and he tied them to the bottom of the boat to try and stop that happening. And that's what we did. We did exactly the same thing, except that, as I say, instead of 1,000 kilos of rocks, we took about 400 kilos of rocks, and the rest were camera batteries, and we to the same weight.
Now, how, in terms of your planning, did you sort of have an estimated time that you thought it would take to go from Elephant Island to get, to cross the Southern Ocean and arrive on South Georgia? Did you have sort of a rough time that you sort of estimated that particular journey would take?
Yes, we thought that it would take about a couple of weeks. Basically, if it takes longer than that, you've missed the island anyway, if you know know what I mean. And the other problem for listeners who don't know about boats without keels, and I didn't myself until I started, studying all this years in the years leading up to this expedition, is that, if you've got all these currents and winds that are all going in the same direction and they're pushing you up towards the northeast, and you're coming from the southwest and you're going up in the direction of South Georgia, that's all good. The trouble is if you miss the island, those same currents and winds prevent you from being able to turn around and have another go. You've got to hit the nail absolutely on the head first time. If you miss it, next stop is South Africa, and you wouldn't survive it. So you have to get it right. Otherwise, you're not turning around and coming back. All that would happen if you turn around in the boat with no keel like that is you could be pointing back in the direction you just come from and just be pushed backwards. So you've got to get it right first time.
Now, on this particular journey, how did you sustain yourself with food and water? What sort of food did you eat?
Well, you can't. So Shackleton had his expedition provisions. So in the old days, he used to eat this stuff called pemmican. Pemmican is basically just lard. So it's the congealed fat, that kind of white residue you get in the bottom of the frying pan if you haven't done the washing up. That horrible fat. And they would eat that in solid pieces, or boil it up into what they call hoosh. They just chuck everything into this kind of broth of anything. Whiskey, sugar, tea bags, lard, a few expedition biscuits, anything in there, and they just drink that down. And it was just a high-fat broth. Kept them warm in the very cold conditions. That's what they used to eat. So we had the same thing. But Shackleton supplemented his food with a few penguins and seals and things like that. You obviously can't go around, knocking seals on the head and eating them these days, nor would you want to, and similarly with penguins. So we took some military provisions to substitute for the penguin and the seal meat. We just took basic meat and some kangaroo jerky to substitute.
And what about water? How much water did you take?
Water, we took two whiskey barrels, two old whiskey barrels like he had, and we had, in each one we had about 130 litres of drinking water, so just around 250. We did have a problem with one of them. It got a bit infected, but we just boiled that one and we drank it anyway.
Now, what was it actually like on the Southern Ocean? As you you've taken off and maybe a day or so has passed. Was it ever flat at all, or were the waves just constantly massive?
Well, we had one day when we had reasonably calm conditions right in the middle of the trip, and that was about it. The only other day it was calm-ish was when we left from Elephant Island, and the reason it was sort of calm is because you're so close to shore. The island is acting as a kind of windbreak for the sea. His camp was on the northern side. We left from there, and we arrived on a day when we knew the wind was blowing from the south because we had to land at his camp to start the journey. So they were just about the only two occasions. The rest of the time we had two storms. We were lucky. We had about 55 knots of wind, but that's strong enough. That's about 120 k's an hour in a small boat in big sea. We had all the sails down. We had a little sea anchor, which is, stuck out the back, just a sort of piece of fabric, like a parachute, trying to slow you down. Otherwise, you go down the face of waves too quickly, and you start to run into the back of the waves in front of you. Or you go down the face of waves so quickly that if you start to sluice sideways, you get your steering wrong and you get rolled over. A bit like if you've ever watched surfboat rowing, you're trying to come down a wave and the sweep doesn't get it right, and you start to go sideways, and then the wave rolls you.
Did you get seasick at all?
Yeah, we were all seasick. We actually got to about day 3, and we realised that morale was very, very low, and people were starting to get cold and getting pretty annoyed with one another and things like that. We realised that we pretty much hadn't eaten up to that point because of the seasickness. No one took any kind of medication to prevent it. That would have been cheating, I guess. So we just did it as he did, and took a few days to really try to get used to it. And even then, the conditions below deck, it's such an enclosed space that, with the fumes from the old Kero stove and the movement of the boat, which was all over the place, you were being thrown around all the time, and seasickness was a constant problem.
Now, what about with navigation? How difficult was it to navigate? Because I believe you guys used a sextant to navigate.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, well, basically, it is very difficult. I mean, it's difficult, particularly in that kind of boat. With the sextant, the idea is you measure your angle upwards to whatever kind of celestial body you're going to use. So you can use the moon, you can use stars, or you can use the sun. You don't really see the moon or stars down there. So what we did was we were looking for sun sights. The difficulty is you need the sun to be a nice, clear disc in the sky, literally like a drawing from a kid's book. It's got to be a perfect little sort of circle so that you can get an accurate enough angle to the edge of the disk of the sun to start doing your calculations.
Yeah, that would have been super hard, especially with the waves, the constant motion of the boat, trying to get like the sextant sort of level, to try and get.
It was very difficult, and the difficulty is that you need also to be looking at the sun when the sun is at its highest point in the sky. In other words, noon, where you are. And the difficulty is you more or less need to know where you are to know when to start looking for the sun, because you need to know, roughly where you are to know when it's noon where you are, if you know what I mean. There's no point measuring the sun when it's early in the morning and it's low on the horizon. You've got to have it when it's at the high point. That's the way the calculations work. And you take 20 sights of the sun in a row, and you'd wait until the first one would show the sun at a particular angle, the next one might show the sun a little bit higher and a bit higher and a bit higher, and then it levels out, and it levels out, then it starts to go down, and you realise that the couple of readings before that one, when it started to go down, were when the sun was at its high point, and they're the ones you use for your calculations.
Going from Elephant Island to South Georgia, it's sort of like an arc, an arc that goes sort of from northeast in that sort of arc formation.
Yeah.
In terms of the navigation, did you ever sort of deviate from hitting South Georgia, or were you sort of always on track to get to land in South Georgia?
Well, you never really know. I mean, the thing is, the idea was South Georgia's at 54 degrees south, so it's quite a long way down. It's right in the middle of the worst ocean down there, 54 south. The way those noon sights I was mentioning work is that you measure them to get your latitude. In other words, how far north or south you are on the planet. They don't tell you how far east or west you are. So left to right you don't get, you only get up and down. So the idea was to try and get to 54 degrees south and then turn right and follow 54 south until we hit South Georgia. That was the plan, and that's the way that a lot of traditional navigators would have done it. So every day we just tried to go north from Elephant Island, knowing that the currents were actually pushing us over to the east, to the right-hand side every day. Every hour, every minute, you're being pushed to the right, and you're just trying to keep going north as best you can, in the knowledge that you're going to kind of go across in an arc, like you say, towards the right, and then try and reach the magic 54. And once you've got to 54, you literally turn right, and you hope that you've got winds and currents behind you, and you can kind of follow 54 south. I mean, it sounds easy, but it's not, of course, but that's the theory.
Now, with that part of the world, there would have been a lot of accumulation of ice on the boat. Well, was there like a lot of ice that sort of built up on the sail and on?
Yeah, we did have some. We had enough for it to be a problem, and I wouldn't say the boat got weighed down with it. I think Shackleton had it worse than we did in that regard, but we did certainly have very, very slippery conditions on the boat. So whenever you had to get up and do anything, bear in mind you're not wearing protective clothing and guy lines and EPIRBs and neoprene jackets and things like that. You're just wearing your old cotton smock with your woolens and leather boots and that kind of stuff. In a storm, we had a bit of old rope we tied around our waist, to hold us in. So going up on the deck where you're kind of skittering around in the ice was always, got the heart rate up.
Now, how many days into the boat journey did it take until you actually saw land, until you saw South Georgia? G'day guys, Matt here. This podcast is a labour of love and all episodes are researched, scheduled, edited, created and promoted in my spare time. Typically, after an episode has been recorded, it can take another 3 hours of post-production activities to get the final cut. If I'm providing you with value and you wish to support my vision of sharing these inspirational stories to the world, you can do so at borntokickarse.com and click on the Patreon banner. Your support will help to maintain the monthly podcast running costs and enable me to outsource repetitive tasks so I can bring you even more Kick Arse episodes. Once again, if you want to support me in producing this podcast, head over to borntokickarse.com and click on the Patreon banner. You can't miss it. And now back to the rest of the show. Now, how many days into the boat journey did it take until you actually saw land, until you saw South Georgia?
2 weeks it took, 2 weeks. And, 2 weeks, I don't know, may or may not sound like a lot to listeners, but I mean, it's a long time when you're in a, state of not knowing really when the boat's going to tip up right, tip the other wrong way up. The sea is the very worrying thing. It's pretty inhospitable down there, and 2 weeks in a boat like that is a long time. So when we saw it, we were pretty pleased.
Seeing the land would have been one thing, but then the realization of, you've got this massive current behind you. Landing the boat on South Georgia. How difficult was that? Yeah, that's a problem. Yeah, that's a real problem. I mean, that's right. I always say that, the problem the day we got to South Georgia was the fact that we got to South Georgia. We spent 4.5 years trying to plan it to get there, and then the day you get there, you kind of wish you weren't there, because you've got these same currents and winds that have propelled you up in that direction now pushing you straight onto the island, and the cliffs on that southern side are, it's a very, very inhospitable coastline. A lot of it is still uncharted. It's very, very rocky, and the cliffs are 200-300 meter high cliffs. It's really pretty formidable, and you're going in, regardless of what you do. Basically, you can't row backwards or put your sea anchor out. You can take your sails down. You can do all these things, but you're going to go in regardless. The question is where. And when you landed on South Georgia, where did you land? Was the landing itself like a violent landing, or did you sort of manage to find somewhere sheltered to sort of land?
The approach was very violent in that we ended up in this situation. By the way, when you've got the current, the wind behind you pushing you straight onto land, and you're in the middle, it's called the lee shore, so you just got no opportunity to get away. So the problem we had was we knew we were going in, and we narrowly missed ending up on the rocks as we approached. And the problem we had is we had to land where Shackleton did in order to start the land journey where he did. And the day we got there with the wind and the currents and everything that we had, you wouldn't really have wanted to do that, but we had no choice. We had to land where he did to start the journey, and he landed in a place called King Harken Bay, so that's where we landed. And it's very rough on the approach. When you get into the bay, you're sheltered, but it's a big if. You've got to get in there first.
And what was it like when you actually landed and, the boat was sort of secure and you got off the boat. You'd spent the last 2 weeks sleep deprived, battling hypothermia, starving. What was that like when you...
Relief, just relief. It's funny, you have a sensation of... there was a moment of elation when we landed. The boat touches the shingle of the beach there, and then you're onto the land, and you can't quite believe you've made it. And there was just a moment of elation where everybody just, we all got round. A big group hug situation happened pretty much immediately we arrived, but then it's just replaced by just an overwhelming sense of relief that you made it, because it's a dangerous, very dangerous thing. No one else had managed it since he did.
I guess coupled in with that relief, you're only half of your journey's done and dusted. After that relief had sort of kicked in, did you sort of then think, we're only halfway, we've now got to traverse South Georgia, which is pretty much in the middle of nowhere. The land is, inhospitable. It's covered in ice and snow. And what were you sort of thinking then? How far was the actual journey on foot from the point you landed to where you had to get to?
Well, it's only about 35 k's, but I say only. I mean, it's Everest is only about 5, so it just depends what terrain you're going over, and it's one of those things. We got there. 3 of the guys' feet were in very bad shape from the boat trip. 2 of them were sailors. 1 of them was a climber. So that really only left, myself and Baz, the army mountain leader, and Paul Larson, the sailor, to do the crossing. The other guys just weren't in a good enough shape to do it. And I think the problem we had when we arrived is that everybody had been spending all of their waking hours thinking about how the hell do we get through the boat journey, and then suddenly you make it, and you realise there's a phase 2, and you just you're then in a situation of relative safety on the beach, and then you've got to build yourself up a second time to go from that position of safety back up into the mountains of South Georgia, and that was a difficult moment again.
So did you put like screws in your shoes for grip?
Yes, I did. Yeah, look, I had some old hobnails on the bottom of mine, a bit like a golf stud. They weren't very good, but I had them, and I supplemented them with a few nails. Baz put screws through the welt of his shoes, and Paul Larson just wore modern boots because he was a sailor, and his role had not originally been to do the climb. The idea was the 3 climbers would do it, and the 3 sailors would be our backup, because there's no one else around. You've got 9 people on South Georgia, and they live 40 k's away, and they're a penguin biologist and a diesel mechanic. They just live in a small series of huts on a remote beach. They're not going to come and get you in the mountains. And the Falklands is 1,000 k's away, so you're really on your own. So that was the original plan.
Paint a picture of the actual mountain range. Sort of what it was. Is there just one mountain range, or is there sort of multiple mountain ranges that you needed to cross?
Well, the whole island is just consists of mountains and glaciers. That's what it is. It's just so it is one mountain range, I guess, but there's multiple valleys, very steep-sided cliffs, glaciers. It is very, very spectacular, very severe mountain scenery. Lots of mountains that come straight out of the sea. A bit like South Island, New Zealand, in the most rugged bits. It's pretty spectacular. And what I will say about the crossing is that the climbing up is actually not that difficult. They may sound very counterintuitive, but actually the most dangerous bits are descending. And most mountaineers will tell you that the most dangerous bit of mountaineering is going down. Most people die descending from the summit, not going up. your centre of gravity's off and you're tired, and it's very difficult going down. And anyway, that's the case with South Georgia. You've got two big glaciers to cross, and you've got two very dangerous bits of mountaineering, two mountain sort of ranges to descend.
Were there many crevasses at all?
The whole place is full of them. So the two glaciers we crossed, one's called the Crean, and it's named after one of the guys on the original trip, Tom Crean, the Irishman. And that was just full of glaciers, one after another, after another, after another, after another. And you could see them all because there's virtually no snow on the surface of the glacier. The next one is called the Fortuna, and for some reason that was just like cotton wool. It was just white. You couldn't see any of the crevasses, but you knew they were there, and we fell in lots of times.
And how deep were the crevasses? Do some of them just sort of go off into darkness?
Oh, yeah. I mean, they go a long, long way. The scale of the environment there is big. It's still big. It's not the Antarctic anymore. This is the sub-Antarctic. So you've reached a point, 1,500, 2,000 k's away from Antarctica at this stage. But it's still an Antarctic scale of environment. So the glaciers are, can be, couple hundred meters thick, and the crevasses down into them can be 50, 60, 80 meters deep. So, you fall in one, you're probably not going to come back out if you're not roped up.
How long did it take to then get to the whaling station on the other side of South Georgia?
It took 96 hours.
And did you sort of do a non-stop push all the way through, or did you sort of camp anywhere? Or
well, we had to. This is where our journey kind of deviated a little bit from Shackleton's, because we rendezvoused with a couple of Discovery Channel camera guys who'd come in on a much bigger vessel at South Georgia, and the idea was that they would film us doing the crossing of the mountains. And in fact, the three sailors from our six-man crew were going to act as their kind of safety guys, you see. But as I've just said, two of the sailors and one of the climbers on our six-man crew were out with their feet being very badly frozen. So that left us just with three, and the two camera guys, they started off the journey with us, but they got about 4 or 5 hours in, and the first guy got injured, and he felt he couldn't continue. And we had to put up an emergency tent for this guy to stay with him during the night, feed him painkillers and things like that. And then during the course of the night, the second cameraman decided that he didn't like the look of things either, and so he pulled the pin too. So we had to stay with those guys for about 36 hours in a tent, and then evacuate them, and then continue the journey. So it was a sort of extra task we just didn't need, but that's what we had to do.
And how difficult was it to manage? What were the winds like? Was it real windy there?
Yeah, you have this stuff called katabatic wind. You get it in the Antarctic and the subantarctic, and up in the Arctic too. It's basically we get such cold, dense air masses that when they go down slopes, they pour down the slopes almost like water pours down a slope in Australia. Really, they just pour down and they howl, and they have some of the strongest winds in the world are katabatic winds. And so we had 85 knots, which is a lot of wind. It's 170 k's, 180 k's an hour, and that's enough to shred your tent, which of course is exactly what happened to us. It destroyed one of the tents. We only had two, and as I say, we had to camp with the two camera guys until dawn, when we were going to try and get them out, and we had to wait a little bit longer than that. And then we finally did manage to get them out, but not before the tents had been basically more or less ruined.
What was harder to manage? Like staying warm, or not as cold, or not as freezing cold as as you were, or keeping your nutrition and your fluids up?
I would say there's a third one. I think it's just the mental side of just trying to keep it all together. I think I think fluids and food, you can eat just about anything when you're hungry, and you'd be surprised how long you can keep going for, even when you're very, very tired. Keeping the warm in the very, very windy, cold conditions in essentially pretty bad old clothes that are not designed for the job, that's very, very hard too. But I think the most difficult thing was the psychological burden of just, knowing what lay ahead, knowing that, as modern people, you knew that about the existence of Gore-Tex and Kevlar and sat phones and, all that kind of thing. But we chose not to use any of that, to do it the same way as Shackleton. So you knew your suffering could have been alleviated by using modern kit. But you chose not to, and all of that becomes very hard.
You've done a lot of previous expeditions leading up to this particular one. How much of the experience that you have been through previously, how much of that helped you on this particular expedition? Did you sort of draw on, the mindset and draw on all your previous experiences to help you get through this particular one?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything from, how you lead a team of people, I would qualify that, how you participate as a team member with a team of people. Sometimes you're leading, sometimes others take over in a particular situation that demands their skills, whatever it is. You learn all of the tricks from previous trips as to how to kind of conduct yourself to get the best outcome for everybody. You learn all the tricks of the trade about breaking down the total journey into manageable pieces to be able to kind of see your way through the challenge you set for yourself. You learn all the techniques to do with how you keep warm and you keep your kit and your body together when it's deteriorating fast in the very bad conditions. You learn all sorts of stuff along the way, how you try and keep positive in situations when it's very, very tough. And so you're constantly calling upon the things you've done before.
So as expedition leader, was that always in your mind to try and keep tabs on the morale of the other guys and even yourself?
Yeah, look, it was. And look, Shackleton was an absolute master of that stuff. I mean, he really looked after his people extremely well. And look, I didn't try and be him or anything, but I mean, I am my own person, but I did keep an eye on other people and they kept an eye on me. And we got to know one another so well over the years of planning that you really understand what makes people tick, and you know what it takes to keep them going when they're feeling a bit down, and when they're likely to be feeling down because you know them well enough to see when that's coming and see the signs. And so you all look after one another. So it's a two-way street between them and me, really.
What was it like when you got to the point where you were coming to the end of the overland expedition, where you, I think you were like in the actual documentary, you were standing on some cliffs and you could see down where the whaling station was? What was that like?
It's an amazing feeling. I mean, you just cast your mind back thinking that, almost 100 years before us, Shackleton was standing in the same spot. And, he had only a few hours before that said to his men, if I've got it right and we are where I'm hoping we are, we should be able to hear the whistle from the whaling station base that's calling the guys back to work for the afternoon shift, and sure enough, they listen out and they hear this sound from in the distance, and it's the whaling station. He said it's the sweetest sound he ever heard, sweetest music he ever heard, I think he said. So look, yeah, I mean, it was amazing seeing, it's a ruined base now. It's not functioning, obviously, but still an amazing thing to look down on it from the mountains.
And that was in a place called Stromness, was that right?
Yeah, that's right. That was there were 5 whaling stations on the coast, but Stromness was the one that they were trying to reach. The other ones were not manned all the time. Stromness was a proper big whaling station with 100 men working there round the clock processing whales. So that's the one they had to get to try and get a big ship sent back down to the Antarctic to rescue the men they'd left behind.
So in that particular, that whole expedition that you managed to successfully see through, was there like a scariest moment that you came upon?
Oh, look, I think there were a few. I mean, I think middle of the night in a storm in the Southern Ocean in a boat that's trying to tip over is not much fun, especially when you're on the helm and you've got the grey of the waves and the spray and often the waves just crashing over the boat. You're wet. The boat is very, very unstable. You can't really see what you're doing. You're doing everything by the light of a candle, or if there's a moon, hopefully a little bit of moonlight coming through, but you very seldom actually saw the moon itself. You just got a bit of light. So I had some real moments out on the ocean. In the mountains, falling into the crevasses, we fell in about 20 times between the three of us. Sometimes just, you break through a snow bridge and you're going up to your waist, and sometimes you go all the way in and you just wait for the rope to hopefully go taut, and for the, knowing that someone's held you fall and you're about to get pulled out, or climb back out. And I think the very steep descents off the mountains were also very very challenging. Just basically whenever we let our guard down and thought, wow, we're through it, we've done it, there'd be something else. And I remember the last descent off this ridge was about 1,000 foot, about a 300 and something meter down climb, and it got steeper and steeper and steeper. And you've got these nails and screws in your boots not providing you with very much grip, and it's pretty challenging.
Yeah, it's an incredible achievement that you've done. When Shackleton did it 100 years ago, he then, I think he did he do four, like he attempted 4 times from South Georgia to go back to Elephant Island to pick up his men, was that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, no, he did. He tried to get a big whaling ship sent south. So first of all, he picked up the guys on the other side of the island that he'd left, the 3 that he left when he got there, and then all 6 of them were united, and they were at the whaling station, and they said, okay, let's get the big ship and go back and pick up the other 22 down in the Antarctic, which is still a huge trip, even in a bigger whaling ship. And they couldn't get through the pack ice. They tried twice, two separate occasions, 2 separate ships couldn't get through. So in the end, he had no choice but to go in a whaling boat back to South America, which is going in the wrong direction. He got back to South America, and he managed to call in a few favours, and he got a ship sent south, and that caught fire on the way down. They had to abandon that one, and he ended up back in southern Chile, and the Chilean Navy said, look, we'll do it. You come with us. And they sent a pretty small ship called the Yelcho, and he went on that one. It was the 4th occasion, the 4th attempt before he rescued his men. It was 4 months later.
Yeah, that's an incredible. I think they sort of say that it's one of, or if not the greatest, survival story and rescue mission of all time.
Yeah, Edmund Hillary said that, and I'm, if he says it's the case, then I'm inclined to agree with him. And look, I would definitely say that, we didn't do everything Shackleton did. We didn't sink a perfectly good ship and live on the pack ice for 10 months, and in the boat initially, and then on the pack ice for another 5. And we just did the small boat journey, and that was very, very tough. And then the mountaineering, which is also very, very tough. So hats off to Shackleton. I mean, amazing trip.
Now, of all the expeditions that you've done over the last numerous decades, North Pole, South Pole, the Shackleton epic, is there a particular, what have you sort of learnt about yourself on these expeditions? Sort of pushing the envelope in terms of human endurance and all the suffering that you go through, and having to dig deep and finding that extra thing that you didn't know you had. Is there anything in particular that sort of really stands out for yourself that sort of bubbles to the surface that you've found out about yourself over the years?
Well, I think the fact that look, I believe that this adventurous spirit in people is just a human characteristic. I mean, we have this need to find out more about the meaning of this existence of ours. What's it all about? And that can mean everything from literal journeys of exploration where you go and actually find out a bit about the geography of a new place, or you try and discover new tribes, or it can be a much more kind of like a metaphor where you know, the journey of exploration is a very different one. It's a very personal journey. You know, you go off to discover more about yourself, and you can do that through any number of different means. It could be artistic self-expression, could be medical research, could be, you know, any number of different things. Astronomy. Some people, it's going to the furthest, most remote places and testing yourself to see what comes out. And look, I think the thing I've learned is the fact that I need it, and I need to keep on going on that journey of discovery to find out more. And I think it really does strip back life to basics, so that you see life when you come back to the 21st century internet world that we live in. You know, there seems to be a kind of a hollowness to it all, and you when you're down there, you are living just on raw emotion, and it's a very empowering feeling. It feels much more real, in fact, than coming back to everyday life.
Now, you're also an environmental scientist. With these expeditions, do you use these as sort of field trips, or are you sort of working as an environmental scientist as well as being an adventurer at the same time?
Well, look, I do some science along the way on some occasions. On this trip I didn't, but what I do is I use the stories and the images and the things I've seen, backed up by other people's science, to talk about the science of things like climate change. But I also I use the expeditions and the opportunity with things like the public speaking, talk about leadership and teamwork and all of those good corporate take-homes. I use that as an opportunity to get my foot in the door with organisations and people who probably wouldn't listen to an environmental message, and you get in there on that score, and then you can pitch a little bit of environmentalism on the back of your adventure, you know. So I use the expeditions as a means to communicate.
And you're the founder of 250.com?
Yeah, 250 is the genesis. That whole the project basically is climbing all the mountains of the equator that have a glacier left, and there are 25 of them. And in a quarter of a century, the ice will be gone due to climate change. So the 250 name is all about those two sets of numbers: 25 mountains at zero latitude, 25 years, be no ice left. And the whole kind of idea came to me when we did the crossing of South Georgia in the footsteps of Shackleton, because for him, he had to cross these three big glaciers, and for us, we only had to cross two. The third one had gone due to climate change. And I thought, you know, melting glacial ice is a very good visual way to show an otherwise very difficult to show problem like climate change. You know, you can't see or smell carbon, but you can see where ice used to be and where it is now, and you can show it visually.
Of all of the expeditions that you've done, is there one particular one that you're most proud of?
Yeah, look, I think I'm a pretty self-deprecating sort of person. I don't big note myself with the things that I do, really. I mean, and what I can say honestly about Shackleton is it was a complete team effort. You know, we couldn't have made it without Paul and Nick and Seb doing the fantastic sailing. Yes, the rest of us had to do it too, but I mean, they were the real skill behind the sailing. And in terms of my climbing partners, you know, Baz and Ed doing the mountaineering in South Georgia, fantastic guys too. So I'm very proud to do all that. And every expedition is the same. It always involves, you know, to a certain extent, other people helping you get the job done. But look, I think if you ask me to say a particular one, I'd say probably getting to South Pole was one of the highlights for me. It was, you know, it's a big deal to go from the edge of the Weddell Sea. I didn't go from the place where everybody else goes from. I say everybody else, there aren't that many, but you know what I mean. The people who do go to the South Pole, to my mind, they do the easy way. They start from hundreds and hundreds of Ks further in from where the solid rock of the Antarctic starts. But of course, the Antarctic is made up of ice and rock. And in fact, if you took the ice away, there wouldn't be a continent at all. There'd be a collection of islands and bits of land. And so I went from where the ice starts, which is 350, 400 k's further out, where Shackleton would have landed. Basically, had his ship been able to land, and went into the South Pole that way. And I was very, very proud to, 47 days later, to arrive at the South Pole and scare the scientist that who was on the night shift, who was working there, when I walked up from behind and put my hand on his shoulder.
Yeah, that would have been, he would have crapped himself.
He did, for him, look, he was because South Pole is on Kiwi time, so they're on Christchurch time, South Pole, because they get their air supply, resupplies from Christchurch. And I'd left 47 days earlier on Chilean time, so for me it was middle of the morning, for him it was middle of the night, even though we were both at the same place.
Now, if you could make, just on advice, if you could make a phone call to the 20-year-old Tim Jarvis and give him some advice, what would you tell him?
Just go and do it. Don't let people tell you can't. And I think that applies to anything in life. I mean, I think for me, I think risk-taking is about the most worthwhile pursuit that you can be involved in. I think, risk drives humanity, really. It drives everything we've ever achieved, whether it's reputational risk, financial risk, a bit of physical risk. Don't go and be stupid, but just take risks. And, if your heart wants to do something, give it a try and back yourself and see what happens. I mean, I think back about where I would be now if I hadn't taken risks and just backed myself. And, I shudder at the thought. I've enjoyed the journey so far, and it's by basically taking a few risks and backing myself.
Now, is that it for you? Are you sort of done and dusted now with adventures, or have you got sort of anything that's sort of brewing or you're actively working towards?
Oh, no, there's lots of stuff going on. So the 25-0 mountains are not going away anytime soon. So I've done 3. In fact, the teams, so we had multiple teams climb different mountains at the same time during the climate change talks. We beamed in images and video from the summits of the mountains to the climate change talks, and we managed 8 mountains as a group. But so there are still 17 more of those mountains to do. I want to go to Greenland because Greenland's got some really wonderful uncharted bits. So I'm working on that at the moment. Lots of things in the pipeline. I've got another idea for a film, which is just an interesting expedition that's got a strong environmental focus, but that would be pretty good fun to do as well. So working on lots of things. I'm going to the Antarctic 3 times in the next 6 months, going back down to South Georgia and Elephant Island, following Shackleton again, but this time taking other people. I'm pretty excited to be going with Conrad Anker in December. He's a fantastic mountaineer.
I just had a question that sort of just popped into my mind just then. When you go to Antarctica, parts of Antarctica are sort of like divided up, and I don't know whether managed is the right term, by other countries. Is that sort of how it is?
Well, yeah, what's happened is there's an international treaty that everybody signed. So, in fact, even you may be in the New Zealand bit or the Australian bit or the Argentinian bit or the British bit, at the end of the day, they're using pretty much the same laws, just, enacted in their own legislation and written in their own language, but essentially it's the same treaty which governs everything down there, which basically says you can't do any mining, you can't do anything related to defense, or it's just peaceable science down in the Antarctic. And look, it's good news. Doesn't mean, again, that we're out of the woods, because there are various countries around that I won't mention who, are probably at a drop of a hat, they'll be down there wanting to take out the coal and oil and all the minerals that will definitely lie under the ice. And it's things like the treaty, the Antarctic Treaty, that are preventing that from happening. So long may it continue. Let's just hope we wean ourselves off fossil fuels before we've got the need to go down there and start looking for them.
Yeah, well, it's been fascinating talking with you and hearing about the Shackleton epic. Whereabouts can people find you online and, follow your the next sort of adventure or expedition that you're going to go on?
Well, there's timjarvis.org is my website. There's shackletonepic.com. There's 250.com. That's 25, the number's 25 and then the word 0.com. So there's lots of places you can find out what I'm doing. Twitter is Tim Jarvis AM. Facebook as well, Tim Jarvis AM. And I'm on LinkedIn, so I'm everywhere. And I've even got a YouTube channel now, Tim Jarvis again, and talking about the things I've done and showing some interesting clips and ideas from the expeditions that I've done and the ones that are coming. So I've embraced the technology, and I'm broadcasting on a few channels.
Excellent. Yeah, well, I'll put those links in the show notes, and I'll put a link to the Shackleton Epic documentary as well, which I got heaps of value out of it, watching it. And it's just fascinating seeing that journey that you've undertaken. It's incredible. But thanks again for your time, and good luck with everything in the future. Yeah,
thanks, Matt. No, I've really enjoyed it.
No worries. Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay, bye for now.
You've just been listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast at borntokickarse.com. If you liked what you heard and want more, please subscribe on iTunes. Give a 5-star rating and a Kick Arse review. This really helps to boost our presence and continues to allow us to introduce you to the most fascinating people on the planet. Welcome aboard, and catch you next time.